Good afternoon to this press conference. More than 1,000 representatives of indigenous peoples from all corners of the world are here this week and the next for the 18th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And we have three distinguished speakers here with us today to discuss questions related to the conservation of indigenous peoples' lands and territories and the challenges for realizing human rights in this context. We have Mr. Elifuraha Laltaika. He is the Executive Director of the Association for Law and Advocacy for Pastoralists and a lecturer at Tumaini University in Makumira, Tanzania. He is a member of Tanzania's National Bar Association and an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Ms. Rukka Sombolinggi is a Toraja from Sulawesi, Indonesia, and a longtime activist in the indigenous people's rights movement. In 2017, she was elected as the first woman to be Secretary General of AMAN, Indonesia's major indigenous peoples organization with close to 2,500 member communities comprising some 19 million people. And we have with us Mr. Mordecai Ogada. He is an ecologist and a co-author of The Big Conservation Lie, the untold story of wildlife conservation in Kenya. He has been involved in conservation work in Kenya and other parts of Africa, mainly on human-wildlife conflict mitigation and carnivore conservation. Each of the speakers will make short introductory remarks, and then the floor is open for questions. Mr. Laltaika, why don't you start?
Thank you very much. I think, as you have put it very correctly, this is a very topical issue because it involves conservation of nature, but it also involves human rights. And let me say that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, to which I'm a member, has made a study that would look at how these matters intersect. And the reason why we thought this is a very important topic currently is because, conservation has a history as putting more emphasis on fortress model where communities would be seen as, a problem to conservation. And we think we want, as a global think tank that has advisory role, to sort of change the narrative a little bit and show the world, stakeholders more broadly, that conservation is so much intrinsically connected to lives of people, and that communities are conservators actually. And therefore we commissioned a study, the forum commissioned a study which was co-authored by myself and another expert member, Brian Keane. And the report has, I must say, attracted overwhelming interest globally among indigenous communities, some governments, as well as conservation organizations. And as a result, we had a meeting in Nairobi we call the expert group meeting, which is a normal part of the business of the UN Permanent Forum. So we held a meeting there, and we invited different stakeholders to chat out the way forward. And what the forum wants to do going forward is really to agree on some overarching principles, probably going along the models of the human rights and business principles, which would enable actors to voluntarily agree on some key issues that they need to adhere to when it comes to conservation. But to conclude, I must say that these are competing interests that are crucially important. It's very important to conserve nature, including wildlife and forest and water catchment areas, but it's also very important to respect communities and see them as integral part of the ecosystem, especially indigenous communities that depend on nature for their livelihood. And it's also important to acknowledge that role that the little biodiversity that we have is not by chance that is found in indigenous territories and lands, it's because of the livelihoods that are very much compatible to conservation. So we need to reward them and recognize that role as opposed to seeing them as criminals and adopt legal and policy measures that would contravene their right to land. So this is a global report, and the recommendations that would come out of it are probably of global nature as well, although countries are at liberty to contextualize them to suit their own unique situations. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Naitaka, Sombolinggi, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Greetings from Indonesia. In my language, we say Manasumoraka, which means have other food ready. So that's our greetings, how important food and solidarity in our community. We don't have good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We only say, have you cooked? Have you eaten? So it's basically our greetings. I think, firstly, it is important for all of us to understand that for indigenous peoples, all indigenous territories are conserved, are conservation areas. Because these territories are protected using indigenous knowledge, governed by customary laws and indigenous institutions. The problem we are facing is because of their conflicting laws and also the conservations so far that have been very much dominated by non-indigenous paradigm that has also become the paradigm of the government in terms of perceiving conservations. In Indonesia, our government have accepted officially 10 million hectares of indigenous peoples map that we mapped ourselves by indigenous peoples. Almost 2 million hectares of these maps of this land are designated by the government under the conservation areas. The situation is indigenous peoples and conservation areas, we don't have great history. Because in our history is about we are being expelled, our houses are being burned down, our livelihood are being destroyed, our people are being criminalized. So that's basically conservation areas in the eyes of indigenous peoples. So when I go back to this, what we call 2 million hectares, that is actually within the conservation areas of government, our demand now is this area remain as ecosystem that is so much intact. Why? Because we keep them. If we compare with the conservation areas that is fully controlled by the government, there are actually many illegal activities in that areas. Illegal loggings, even some of the wildlife conservations in Indonesia has been actually used for oil palm plantations. So those illegal activities, illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal plantations within indigenous, within a government conservation area. So there are three existing laws of Indonesia now criminalized indigenous peoples on the name of conservation. And that is the forest law, and also we have the what's so-called eradications of forest degradations, and also the conservation laws. So these three are the one that has been always used to put us behind the bar and to burn down our houses. And the situations now is we try to talk with our government that these 2 million hectares has to be returned under control by indigenous peoples. Otherwise, as we are now battling climate change, because this is included in the 40 million hectares of remaining forest that's still under the control of indigenous peoples, but all of them are at threats. So when we are talking about combating climate change, it is very important to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples to have control over these remaining forests, including those within conservation areas. So I think that's from me for now, and I hope that the studies that has been conducted by the UN Special Rapporteur and also UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as other institutions, can really end the criminalizations of indigenous peoples on the name of conservation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sombolinggi. Our last speaker is Mordecai Ogada. Please, Mr. Ogada.
Thank you very much. I come into this discussion on indigenous people from a technical and philosophical background. As my introduction says, I'm a wildlife ecologist by training, and I've been involved in wildlife practice for about 20 years now in Kenya. What comes out from wildlife practice in Kenya and other parts of Africa is that it has a heavy bias towards the enhancement of tourism activities, and it has a heavy bias towards the Western fortress conservation model. As Elifra said earlier on, indigenous populations have conserved these wildlife for several generations, but their livelihoods right now are actively being suppressed by conservation interests, and particularly I refer particularly to pastoralism in the savannas of East Africa. Pastoralism is what has kept wildlife surviving in those areas. It's part of the way those rangelands have evolved, the grasses and the cycles, etc. And this is well known to science. So there's an inherent dishonesty in the way science now places pastoralists in the position of being a challenge to conservation, when they are probably the best guardians of these ecosystems. But philosophically, that comes from tourism, because we keep selling a tourism product that includes pristine, quote-unquote, landscapes devoid of human presence, which itself is a fallacy, because East Africa is known to be the cradle of mankind. Basically, those plains have never been without people, and that is very much a colonial construct. So, and in countries like Kenya, we are now getting to a point where we are, through the criminalization and the vilification of pastoralist communities, we are getting to a point where wildlife conservation is something of a war. It's not a peaceful thing. There are even organizations that call themselves Wildlife at Risk, and the acronym being WAR. And you can see the rhetoric around it. We are all being told there's a crisis. There's poaching. Elephants are going to disappear in the next 10 years because one is killed every 15 minutes. This is a commonly shared, it's a commonly shared line that is patently false. And so we are in a very difficult philosophical place, because UNEP has recommendations on the amount of land that should be under protected areas. I think it might be 14% or something. I'm not sure of the exact figure. Looking at the IUCN definition. A protected area is a clearly defined geographical space recognized and dedicated and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. By this definition, protected areas are a problem. This definition makes them sources of disenfranchisement. And we have to find another definition if we are to promote protected areas as a conservation tool. We certainly can't do it under this. And protected areas all over the world, be it Indonesia, Africa, the United States, are monuments to injustice. People were moved out, people were killed in some instances to create these protected areas. So we should not pretend in this day and age that they are good things. We'll keep those that we have because they're part of our history. But we must find another more sophisticated or elegant way of conserving biodiversity or natural ecosystems. Fences are not a solution. They are not socially and ecologically and culturally sustainable, putting up fences across human-dominated landscapes. It's something that's been a cause of war for the last few thousand years in human history. So we need to develop an audit mechanism. Probably the best placed body to do this is the UN. We have audit mechanisms for law enforcement, audit mechanisms for extractive industries, education, and all other, and even medical practice. But we don't have any audit mechanisms for conservation practice because conservationists are thought to be above reproach. We are thought never to do anything wrong. So a mining company will have to adhere to very strict sets of rules. They're there before they can mine somewhere. Be it a logging company, same thing. Agribusiness, the same thing. But not a conservation organization. And one of the areas of serious human rights violations in Kenya and other African countries is conservation. In Kenya, even robbers and terrorists get arrested, but poachers or suspected poachers get shot. Our rangers do not carry handcuffs. And in this day and age, I think the state of ecological knowledge, etc., is at a level where we all know that fragmentation of lands into so-called protected areas can no longer be a step to mitigate the damage to environment. We have climate change. It's a fallacy to imagine that climate change can occur and we can have little islands unaffected by it and call them protected areas. And this is the position where I'm coming from, and I think the time has come now that we must change the thinking around conservation. It cannot be by exclusion of people. That's primitive and antiquated. And in this day and age, human rights do not allow us to pursue it in that manner. So in an ideal world, I think I'd like to pursue the formation of an audit mechanism that can regulate this so that we have things like free, prior, informed consent before conservation activities are undertaken that must satisfy all the norms, must take time because free, prior, informed consent is never a quick thing at any level. So we must put together this and have people subscribe to it and have an audit mechanism that can also audit those that are already going on. Then I think we will be on the track to conserving our biodiversity while safeguarding human rights and dignity of communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all speakers. Floor is now open for questions. And if you would please identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this conference. My name is Oscar Bolanos from OMB News. It's independent media at the UN. And my question is regarding the situation of the indigenous Pueblos in Venezuela. And what is the situation there with them being on the middle of the crisis is happening now? And according to reports, they has been killed because the situation itself with the armed groups on the borders between Venezuela and Brazil. and all this? And as well is what do you have regarding the Minga indigenous in Colombia, where they were striking in Colombia for claiming every year about the territory in Colombia with the government? Thank you.
I don't know, since none of our speakers is from those countries, I don't know if any of you feels in a position to answer.
Yes, let me say probably it's not unique to the region you have mentioned, and I base my answer from the report that the UN Permanent Forum has written. It's fairly a global problem, and the intersection between conservation and community rights is something that's really an epicenter of a lot of conflicts, resource-based. So much as I don't have specific details for that specific region, but I can assure you this is something that is common, and it has its roots from history, as Mordecai said, because of the rhetoric that we need an area that is free from human habitation in order to facilitate tourism, and so on and so forth, while the land is actually shrinking because of other land uses, and the population is growing. So this is something that really needs reflections in order to solve, because we need a safe planet free from conflicts, but we also need to conserve water sources. We need to have trees standing in order to offset carbon and reduce climate change, and so on and so forth. So there's really no 1 + 1 is equal to 2. It's a complex matter that deserves really a complex reflection and solution.
Thank you. Please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your briefing. My name is Sato, Japan Public TV NHK. I have two questions. One is broader, one is specific. First question is about the possible or danger of extinction of the indigenous people's languages, which is one of the main focus in this conference. Can you tell us a little bit about how is going on the discussion about the possible preventive action to the extinction of the indigenous people's languages in general? And another question is about, I was shocked to hear from you that in 10 years, all the elephant will be disappeared. Does it's in the case of in Kenya or in all of Africa? And could you elaborate a little bit about the very serious situation is how the elephant in Africa is facing? Thank you.
Yeah. I was referring to that because it's actually not true. It's not true, but that is what conservation interests keep saying, that and one elephant is killed every 15 minutes, and at this rate they're going to disappear by 2025. I think is the year they were saying, but it's simply not true. It's to maintain the perception of crisis. Conservation seems to survive on the perception of crisis. And this perception of crisis is what opens the path for violation of human rights, removal of people from their homes, etc., to conserve these species. So the crisis is being created by conservation. It's not wildlife law enforcement is important, but it is not the crisis the way they say it is. Yeah, so it's simply not true. That is said by conservation people, but it's simply not true. Yeah.
Yes, and regarding the language, in fact, we are going to get a lot of deliberations because this is this year's theme. It's on traditional knowledge, transmission, and the language is at the center because it's the main medium through which traditional knowledge can be transmitted from one generation to the other. But very quickly, I can assure you that indigenous communities, the language is the transmitter of their values. In fact, even landscapes are named in a way that reflect the geographical characteristics. And I am hesitant to say that, once the language disappears, even the ability to survive in the rangeland, for example, because once they name the rangeland a hill, it also tells them the characteristic of that area. So language is very important, and I think its disappearance will also means disempowerment of communities, especially traditional communities. But we are going to get a lot of scientific deliberations coming out of this. And you said, how are we going to save that? UNESCO has been appointed, and it's at the forefront, both in the coordination of the year of indigenous languages, and probably how to monitor implementation of some of the recommendations that may come out of this meeting.
Yeah, please.
When we talk about conservation, language, and how language will disappear because of conservation, it is very clear that there is direct connections. For example, if it is my people, for example, we have a word to describe hunting. And because of our forest is designated as protected forest, we are not allowed to do hunting anymore. So I haven't heard that word for like almost 30 years because we don't hunt anymore. So many of these activities related to our livelihood, our rituals, our cultural practices is no longer there, and then immediately the language is no longer used because language is words has serve each word serves a meaning, So there's very clear connection because of the extinction of language and also the conservation areas that prevent indigenous peoples into that territories.
Yes, it's just to follow on my question, Venezuela. And I ask you this is because actually this indigenous community region in Venezuela, they're being targeted in deadly battle for riches of Venezuela's El Dorado. So that's why I ask you this is because the situation is a big crisis against the indigenous in Venezuela, because the El Dorado in Venezuela and the expropriation in basically in these resources. And we are talking about in Africa about the elephants. In this case, is the exploitation of gold in Venezuela, where the indigenous are in the middle of this situation.
Again, this is a very specific region. I don't know if any of you feel in a position to directly address it. No, if not,
actually send this message to Vicky Tauli Corpus later, who is the special rapporteur of on indigenous peoples. I'm going to see her in a few minutes, so I can actually convey this message to her. Yeah, well, and you probably also can check her report in case. I'm sure it's very wide. It covers all the countries that has indigenous peoples. So I think it's. I'm sure any cases will be covered in that report.
Thank you, Rukka, for this. If there are no further questions, then thank you very much for your interest and for attending this press conference. Thank you.